This is the subcommittee's second hearing of the fiscal year 2020 budget cycle, and we're reviewing the budget requests for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA. We appreciate FEMA's Acting Administrator, Peter Gaynor, joining us today to help us better understand the important ongoing work of FEMA and how this year's budget request supports that work. This is Mr. Gaynor's first appearance before the subcommittee. As always, I'm pleased to be seated next to my ranking member, and I apologize to him for being a little behind here today, Senator Tester. He and I are continuing our work together to review the 2020 fiscal year budget request for the entire Department of Homeland Security, and today's hearing is a very important piece of that work. FEMA's mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. Acting Administrator Gaynor has a big job. We are all keeping a close eye on the flooding that is occurring right now in our heartland. We have also been following the recent string of devastating tornadoes across the southeast, particularly in Alabama. Mr. Gaynor and the men and women of FEMA are at the tip of the spear when it comes to responding to these types of disasters. In fiscal year 2018, FEMA deployed 20,622 of its personnel, 4,053 surge capacity force personnel, and 373 FEMA Corps personnel to the disaster operations. As we will be reminded today, the men and women of FEMA perform a diverse and challenging array of duties. But when an area of our country is hit with tragedy, even FEMA emergency, every FEMA employee is an emergency manager. You should consider this subcommittee part of your team. In addition to being ready and agile enough to respond to disasters as they pop up, FEMA is often charged with the complexities of coordinating the long-term recovery of U.S. states and territories that are hit with particularly catastrophic disasters. Many Americans might be shocked to know that FEMA is still doing important work to complete recovery from hurricanes that occurred well over a decade ago. We know that recovery from more recent hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Maria, Florence, and Michael in particular, will not happen overnight. We should all hope that the areas affected can quickly recover to the point that assistance from the federal government is no longer needed there. We also ask FEMA to play an important role in helping communities prepare for and mitigate against future disasters. This means that the men and women of FEMA are engaged with state, local, tribal, and territorial partners every day to coordinate, plan, train, and build. The hope is that these investments will save American lives and taxpayer resources tomorrow. In fiscal year 2019, Senator Tester and I worked to ensure that the Disaster Relief Fund, which is the primary tool that FEMA uses to help communities to respond and recover from disasters, had sufficient funding to meet present and future needs. The appropriations bill we worked to get enacted earlier this year provided more than $12 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund. To put this number in perspective, in fiscal year 2019, the Disaster Relief Fund represented approximately 76% of FEMA's total appropriation. The budget request for fiscal year 2020 includes more than $19 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund, but it is my understanding that this estimate was formulated before the enactment of our 2019 bill. We look forward to working with Mr. Gaynor and his team to stay up to date on the revised funding level that will be necessary for fiscal year 2020. The work of this subcommittee has also led to historic investments in training, preparedness, and mitigation. And while we are pleased that this funding is enabling FEMA to invest in the resilience of American communities, it is important for us to better understand the specific return the American taxpayers are getting for this investment. We know FEMA is working to implement the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, which became law last year, and we look forward to working with FEMA to ensure that the changes made to mitigation grant programs by that law are implemented appropriately and responsibly. Finally, like most federal agents, FEMA's efficient operations are dependent on modern technology. We note the budget request's emphasis on targeted investment in IT, system improvements, and we will continue our work to ensure that you have the tools you need to do your job well and make the greatest impact possible before, during, and after a disaster strikes. I see the impacts of FEMA in my state all the time, but most recently during our devastating flash flood in West Virginia in June of 2016. We lost 23 lives that day. Hundreds of homes were destroyed damages totaling millions and millions of dollars. 3 years later, we remember those that we lost and recognize the ongoing efforts to rebuild. FEMA was there when the tragedy struck, and I'll have to say, FEMA was there within an incredible speed, and they're still there now. I would like to thank your Region 3 Administrator, specifically Mary Ann Tierney, for her continued attention to the recovery. I see the importance of the follow-up, the communication, and the support that FEMA can provide. We still have much to do in the West Virginia as a result of these floods. From community leaders, elected officials, volunteer organizations, and state government, our efforts need to continue in the most effective, efficient way. So thank you very much, given all the challenges you face, for continuing to make West Virginia families and communities a priority. Administrator Gaynor, thank you for appearing before us, and we'll make sure that you and your team keep us up to date on what resources you need to continue the good work that you're doing.